It was a chilly autumn evening, and the streets were quiet except for the occasional hum of passing cars. Marcus Thompson tightened his grip on the steering wheel as he drove home after a long day at work. Dressed in a tailored suit and tie, he looked every bit like the successful professional he was. His mind wandered to dinner plans with his family when suddenly, flashing blue and red lights appeared in his rearview mirror. At first, Marcus felt no alarm. He pulled over smoothly, ensuring his car was safely parked along the curb. As he rolled down his window, two police officers approached, their flashlights scanning the interior of his vehicle. One of them, a tall man with a stern expression, asked for his license and registration. Marcus complied without hesitation, keeping his voice calm and respectful. "Is there a problem, officer?" Marcus asked politely, trying to understand why he had been stopped. The officer glanced at him briefly before replying, "You were swerving between lanes back there. We're just making sure everything's okay." Marcus frowned slightly but nodded. He hadn't noticed any erratic movement while driving. He was confident about that. Still, he handed over his documents and waited patiently as the officers inspected them under the glow of their flashlight. What happened next caught him off guard. The second officer, shorter but equally imposing, leaned into the car, his tone sharp. "This is a nice ride you've got here," he said, eyeing the leather seats and polished dashboard. "How does someone like you afford something like this?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Marcus stiffened, sensing where this might be headed. "I'm an attorney," he replied evenly, meeting the officer's gaze. "I worked hard for what I have." But instead of easing the tension, his answer seemed to irritate the officers further. They exchanged glances, then began peppering him with more questions about where he'd come from, where he was headed, even how much cash he had on him. Each query felt less like routine protocol and more like an interrogation. When Marcus politely objected to the line of questioning, things escalated quickly. One of the officers accused him of being uncooperative and demanded he step out of the car. Despite his efforts to remain composed, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was being judged not by his actions, but by the color of his skin. As he stood beside his car, hands raised slightly in compliance, the officers announced they would conduct a search of his vehicle. Marcus protested, reminding them that they needed probable cause. But his words fell on deaf ears. Within moments, he found himself cuffed and placed in the back of a squad car, his dignity stripped away in front of curious neighbors who peeked through their curtains. The night grew colder as Marcus sat there, replaying the events in his mind. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, yet here he was, treated like a criminal simply because of assumptions others made about him. Little did the officers know, though, that beneath the surface lay a story far bigger than they could imagine. And when the truth finally came to light, it would change everything for everyone involved. The hours dragged on as Marcus sat in the cold, dimly lit cell at the local police station. The metallic bench beneath him offered no comfort, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, amplifying his frustration. Despite the circumstances, Marcus kept his composure. He knew that reacting emotionally wouldn't help. He needed to think clearly if he wanted to navigate this situation effectively. His phone had been confiscated during the arrest, so he couldn't call anyone for support. Along with his thoughts, Marcus replayed the events of the night over and over again. He couldn't shake the feeling that the officer's behavior wasn't just about what happened, or didn't happen, on the road. It was something deeper, something rooted in bias and preconceived notions. But even though anger simmered inside him, Marcus reminded himself why he stayed calm. Revealing his true identity too soon could backfire. For now, he had to play the role of an ordinary citizen caught in an unjust situation. It wasn't until early the next morning that relief finally arrived, in the form of his younger sister, Angela. She had received a panicked voicemail from one of their neighbors who witnessed the arrest and immediately sprang into action. When she walked into the station, her usually warm smile replaced by a look of determination, Marcus felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. Angela wasn't just family. She was sharp, resourceful, and fiercely protective. "Are you okay?" Angela asked as soon as she saw him, her voice laced with concern. Marcus nodded but didn't say much, knowing they were still within earshot of the officers milling around the station. Instead, he focused on filling her in quietly about what had transpired. Angela listened intently, her jaw tightening with each detail. By the time Marcus finished recounting the story, her eyes blazed with indignation. "This isn't right," she said firmly. "We're getting you out of here, and then we're going to fight this." With Angela's help, Marcus was released on bail later that morning. As they left the station together, the sunlight felt almost foreign after spending the night locked away. But freedom brought little comfort. News of the arrest had already spread like wildfire through social media. A grainy photo of Marcus being led to the squad car, posted by a bystander, had gone viral overnight. Comments poured in, many of them harsh and judgmental. Some accused him of arrogance. Others questioned whether he deserved special treatment because of his expensive car. Few seemed interested in hearing his side of the story. Back at home, Angela tried to shield Marcus from the online backlash, urging him not to read the comments. But it was hard to ignore the weight of public opinion bearing down on him. Friends and colleagues reached out to express their shock, while strangers jumped to conclusions based on snippets of information. Through it all, Marcus remained stoic. He knew how quickly narratives could spiral out of control when people let biases cloud their judgment. That evening, as he sat alone in his study, Marcus began reviewing every detail of the incident. He retrieved backup footage from his car's dashcam, a habit he'd developed years ago after working on cases involving wrongful arrests. Watching the video confirmed what he already suspected. The officers had twisted facts to justify their actions. There was no swerving, no resistance, just baseless accusations fueled by prejudice. But Marcus also knew that proving his innocence wouldn't be easy. The system often favored those in uniform, especially when the accused was someone society viewed through a lens of suspicion. Still, he refused to give up. If anything, the ordeal only strengthened his resolve. This wasn't just about clearing his name anymore. It was about exposing the cracks in a system that allowed such injustices to happen in the first place. As he prepared for the legal battle ahead, Marcus made a silent vow to himself. No matter how challenging the road became, he would see this through, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever faced similar treatment. And deep down, he knew that the truth, though buried for now, would eventually come to light. In the days following his release, Marcus threw himself into preparing for the trial with a quiet intensity. He knew that this case wasn't just about him. It was about challenging the systemic biases that allowed such injustices to happen in the first place. But as he gathered evidence and strategized with his legal team, he also understood the importance of patience. Revealing his true identity too soon could overshadow the real issues at hand, turning the trial into a spectacle rather than a fair examination of the facts. Marcus's defense attorney, Linda Harper, was one of the best in the business. A seasoned lawyer known for her razor-sharp arguments and unshakable determination, she had agreed to take on the case after hearing Marcus's story. Together, they pored over every detail of the incident. The traffic stop, the officer's behavior, even the wording of their reports. Every inconsistency, no matter how small, became a potential piece of the puzzle. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence came from Marcus's dashcam footage. The video clearly showed that he hadn't swerved or driven erratically, contradicting the officer's claims. It also captured the condescending tone they used when speaking to him, as well as their refusal to listen when he calmly explained himself. Watching it made Marcus's blood boil, but Linda reminded him to stay focused. "This isn't personal," she said firmly. "It's about proving what happened and holding them accountable." Beyond the footage, Marcus worked tirelessly to gather additional proof. He obtained GPS data from his phone, which confirmed that he had been driving steadily within the speed limit. He reached out to the neighbor who had witnessed part of the arrest, convincing them to testify on his behalf. And he reviewed police department policies, highlighting areas where the officers had violated protocol during the stop. Despite all this preparation, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that the odds were stacked against him. The officers involved weren't just any patrolmen. They were respected members of the community with years of service under their belts. Their word carried weight, especially in courtrooms where law enforcement often received the benefit of the doubt. Add to that the public narrative swirling online, and it seemed like an uphill battle. But Marcus refused to let doubt creep in. Instead, he channeled his frustration into action. He spent hours rehearsing his testimony, ensuring that his account would be clear, concise, and impossible to dismiss. He studied courtroom procedures, drawing on his own experience as a prosecutor to anticipate the prosecution's arguments. And he leaned on Linda for guidance, trusting her expertise while contributing insights only someone with his background could offer. Throughout this process, Marcus kept his role as a U.S. attorney hidden, not just from the public, but from everyone involved in the case except Linda. Even Angela didn't know the full extent of his plan. "Why not tell people who you are?" she asked one evening, frustration creeping into her voice. "Wouldn't it make things easier?" Marcus shook his head, his expression thoughtful. "If I do that, it changes everything," he explained. "People will focus on my title instead of the truth. They'll either assume I'm untouchable or accuse me of using my position to get special treatment. I need them to see this for what it is, a case of bias and misconduct, plain and simple." Angela nodded reluctantly, understanding his reasoning but still worried about the risks. She knew how much pressure Marcus was under, both personally and professionally. If things went wrong, the consequences could extend far beyond the courtroom. Yet there was something admirable about his determination to fight this battle on equal footing, without relying on his credentials to tip the scales. As the trial date approached, Marcus felt a mix of nerves and resolve. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that the stakes were higher than ever. This wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about shining a light on the cracks in the system and demanding change. Whatever happened next, Marcus vowed to face it head-on, armed with nothing but the truth and his unwavering belief in justice. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the day of the trial finally arrived. Reporters filled the back rows, notebooks in hand, while curious onlookers craned their necks to catch a glimpse of Marcus Thompson. The air was thick with tension, and whispers rippled through the room like waves. For Marcus, the weight of the moment pressed heavily on his shoulders. He knew this wasn't just another court case. It was a chance to expose the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might make people. The judge, an older man with a stern demeanor, entered the room and called for order. As everyone rose to their feet, Marcus took a deep breath, reminding himself to stay focused. Beside him sat Linda Harper, his attorney, who gave him a reassuring nod before turning her attention to the proceedings. Across the aisle, the two officers involved in the traffic stop sat confidently, flanked by their defense team. Their body language spoke volumes. They believed they had already won. The prosecution opened the case, painting a picture of Marcus as someone who thought himself above the law. The lead prosecutor, a sharp-tongued woman named Rachel Meyer, emphasized the officers' years of service and dedication to protecting the community. "These men are heroes," she declared, her voice ringing through the courtroom. "They were simply doing their job when they encountered Mr. Thompson, who resisted lawful authority and refused to cooperate." Rachel went on to describe the alleged erratic driving that prompted the stop, though she conveniently omitted any mention of evidence, or lack thereof, supporting those claims. She portrayed Marcus's objections during the arrest as signs of arrogance, implying that his polished appearance and luxury car somehow made him less credible. By the time she finished, some members of the audience seemed swayed, nodding along as if her words confirmed what they already suspected. When it was Linda's turn to present the defense's opening statement, the atmosphere shifted. Calm but commanding, she began by acknowledging the respect owed to law enforcement, but quickly pivoted to the heart of the matter: accountability. "This case isn't about discrediting our police force," she said firmly. It's about ensuring that every citizen is treated fairly under the law, regardless of race or socioeconomic status. Linda then outlined the inconsistencies in the officers' accounts, pointing out how their version of events didn't align with the dashcam footage or GPS data. She highlighted the lack of probable cause for searching Marcus's vehicle and questioned whether racial bias played a role in the stop. Her tone was measured yet powerful, forcing the judge and jury to consider uncomfortable truths. Throughout this exchange, Marcus remained silent, observing the reactions of those around him. He noticed the subtle nods from some jurors when Linda raised questions about bias, but he also saw the skeptical glances cast his way. It was clear that opinions were divided, and much of the outcome would hinge on the evidence presented. As the session drew to a close, the judge's expression gave little away. However, Marcus detected a faint sense of impatience, a sign that the judge might be leaning toward siding with the officers. This realization weighed heavily on him, but instead of letting doubt creep in, Marcus used it to steel his resolve. If the system was going to favor the officers based on assumption rather than fact, then it was up to him to tip the scales back toward justice. Back at the defense table, Linda leaned over and whispered, "We've got this." Marcus nodded, though his mind was racing. He knew the next phase, cross-examination, would be critical. It was where the real battle would unfold, where the truth would either emerge or remain buried. And as the gavel struck to signal the end of the day's session, Marcus felt a surge of determination. Whatever happened next, he was ready to face it head-on. The next day in court marked the beginning of the cross-examination phase, a critical moment that would shape the trajectory of the trial. Linda Harper wasted no time diving into inconsistencies in the officers' testimonies, her calm yet piercing questions cutting through their rehearsed answers like a knife. The first officer, Officer Daniels, took the stand looking confident, until Linda began dissecting his account of the traffic stop. "Officer Daniels," Linda began, her tone polite but firm, "you stated in your report that Mr. Thompson was swerving between lanes erratically. Can you explain why there's no evidence of this on the dashcam footage?" She gestured toward the screen where the video played for everyone to see. It showed Marcus driving smoothly, staying within his lane without any sudden movements. Daniels hesitated, clearly caught off guard. "Well, sometimes cameras don't capture everything accurately," he stammered, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. "I saw what I saw." Linda raised an eyebrow. "So you're saying technology can be unreliable, but your memory is infallible?" A murmur rippled through the courtroom as Daniels struggled to respond. Linda pressed further, asking about the timeline of events and pointing out discrepancies between his initial report and his current testimony. With each question, the cracks in his story widened, leaving him visibly flustered. When it was the second officer's turn, Officer Grayson, Linda turned her attention to the search of Marcus's car. "You claimed probable cause based on suspicious behavior," she said, leaning slightly forward. "Can you specify exactly what behavior justified searching the vehicle?" Grayson cleared his throat, glancing at his defense attorney before answering. He seemed nervous and evasive when we asked him questions. "Nervous?" Linda repeated, letting the word hang in the air. Wouldn't anyone feel nervous being pulled over late at night by two armed officers accusing them of wrongdoing? Is feeling nervous now grounds for probable cause? The courtroom erupted in murmurs again, forcing the judge to bang his gavel for silence. Grayson shifted uneasily, his earlier confidence faltering under Linda's relentless questioning. By the time both officers stepped down from the stand, their credibility had taken a significant hit. Then came the moment Marcus had been preparing for, his own testimony. As he walked to the witness stand, the room fell silent. For the first time, all eyes were on him, not just as the defendant, but as someone with a story to tell. He adjusted the microphone, took a deep breath, and began recounting the events of that fateful night. His voice was steady, his words deliberate. He described how he complied fully during the stop, only to be met with hostility and baseless accusations. He spoke of the humiliation of being handcuffed in front of his neighbors, the frustration of having his rights ignored, and the sinking realization that none of this had anything to do with actual wrongdoing. It was rooted in assumptions about who he was. As Marcus recounted these details, something subtle shifted in the courtroom. Jurors exchanged glances, some nodding faintly as if piecing things together. Even the judge leaned forward slightly, listening more intently than before. But what truly changed the atmosphere was Marcus's command of legal terminology and procedure. When he referenced specific statutes violated during the stop or cited case law supporting his argument, heads turned in surprise. This wasn't the average citizen the prosecution had painted him to be. He sounded like someone who knew the system inside and out. By the time Marcus finished speaking, the tension in the room was palpable. The prosecution looked uneasy, whispering urgently among themselves. Linda, meanwhile, gave Marcus a small, proud smile from the defense table. Though he hadn't revealed his full identity yet, it was clear that the tide was beginning to turn. Back at the stand, Marcus locked eyes with the judge, his expression resolute. "Your Honor," he said quietly but firmly, "this isn't just about me. It's about fairness, about holding people accountable, not because of who they are, but because of what they've done." The room remained silent as those words lingered in the air, planting seeds of doubt in minds that had once been so sure. Whatever happened next, Marcus knew he had planted the first crack in the wall of bias standing against him. As Marcus sat back down at the defense table, the courtroom felt different, charged with an energy that hadn't been there before. The jurors exchanged glances, their expressions thoughtful, while the prosecution team fidgeted nervously. It was clear that Marcus's testimony had shifted something in the room, but he wasn't done yet. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, and he knew it was time to reveal the truth. Linda leaned over, whispering urgently, "Are you sure about this?" Her voice was low, tinged with both caution and admiration. She knew what Marcus was about to do would change everything, but she also understood the risks. Revealing his identity now could either solidify the jury's trust or make them question whether he was using his title to manipulate the case. Marcus nodded firmly, his jaw set. He had spent days preparing for this moment, weighing every possible outcome. This was his chance to show the world that justice shouldn't depend on who you are. It should depend on the truth. When it came time for Linda to deliver her closing arguments, she turned to the judge and said, "Your Honor, there's one final piece of information the court needs to consider." She paused dramatically, letting the silence stretch just long enough to capture everyone's attention. Then she gestured toward Marcus. "This man isn't just a private citizen wrongfully accused. He is Marcus Thompson, Assistant U.S. Attorney for Civil Rights Enforcement." The room erupted into gasps and murmurs. Reporters scrambled to jot down notes, while the officer's defense team visibly paled. Even the judge looked startled, leaning forward as if unsure he'd heard correctly. All eyes swung back to Marcus, who stood slowly, his posture calm but commanding. For a moment, the only sound was the faint rustle of papers and the scratch of pens against notepads. "Your Honor," Marcus began, his voice steady and clear, "I chose not to disclose my profession earlier because I wanted this case to be judged on its merits, not on my credentials. I wanted to prove that bias exists even when someone has no apparent power or influence. But now, I think it's important for the court to understand why I know so much about the law, and why I'm so determined to see justice served." He went on to explain his role as a civil rights prosecutor, highlighting cases where he had fought against systemic racism and police misconduct. His words weren't boastful. Instead, they carried the weight of someone who had seen injustice up close and made it his life's mission to fight it. "What happened to me that night wasn't an isolated incident," he said, his tone firm but measured. "It's part of a larger pattern, a pattern we can't ignore if we truly believe in equal treatment under the law." The impact of his revelation rippled through the courtroom. Jurors exchanged meaningful looks, some nodding as if connecting the dots between Marcus's expertise and his composed demeanor during the trial. The judge, who had seemed predisposed to side with the officers earlier, now appeared deeply conflicted. He asked for a brief recess to review the evidence again, citing the need to ensure fairness given this new development. Outside the courtroom, chaos ensued. Reporters crowded around the doors, eager to get a statement from Marcus or his legal team. Social media exploded with reactions as people re-examined the case in light of his identity. Some praised Marcus for exposing the flaws in the system, while others questioned whether his status gave him an unfair advantage. Through it all, Marcus remained focused, knowing the real work was still ahead. Back inside, the judge returned after nearly an hour, his expression unreadable. Before delivering his ruling, he addressed the courtroom solemnly. This case has raised serious concerns about accountability and transparency within law enforcement, he said, his voice heavy with gravity. And it is incumbent upon this court to ensure that justice prevails, not just for Mr. Thompson, but for everyone affected by such incidents. As the judge prepared to announce his decision, Marcus felt a mix of emotions: relief, pride, and a lingering awareness of how much work still needed to be done. Whatever the verdict, he knew this moment would spark conversations far beyond the walls of the courtroom. The courtroom fell silent as the judge adjusted his glasses, shuffling through the papers in front of him. Every eye was fixed on him, waiting for the verdict that would define not just Marcus's fate, but also send a message about accountability and justice. The tension was palpable, with even the reporters pausing their frantic note-taking to listen intently. After careful consideration of the evidence presented, the judge began, his voice steady and measured. It is clear that significant errors were made during the traffic stop in question. He paused, glancing at the two officers seated beside their defense team. While I respect the difficult work law enforcement officers perform daily, it is equally important to hold them accountable when they overstep their authority or act out of bias. He then turned his attention to Marcus, who sat upright, his expression calm but alert. Mr. Thompson demonstrated restraint and cooperation throughout the incident, despite being subjected to treatment inconsistent with proper procedure. Furthermore, the lack of probable cause for searching his vehicle and the discrepancies in the officers' testimonies cannot be ignored. The judge's tone grew firmer as he continued. This court finds the charges against Mr. Thompson baseless and dismisses them entirely. Additionally, I recommend disciplinary action against Officers Daniels and Grayson, including mandatory training on racial profiling and constitutional rights. A collective gasp swept through the room. For Marcus, the weight of months of stress and uncertainty lifted in an instant. He exhaled deeply, allowing himself a small private moment of relief before turning to Linda, who gave him a triumphant smile. Outside the courtroom, cheers erupted as news of the ruling spread. Friends, family, and supporters celebrated what felt like more than just a personal victory. It was a win for fairness and transparency. But Marcus knew this wasn't the end. As he stepped outside the courthouse, cameras flashed, and microphones were thrust toward him. Reporters shouted questions, eager to hear from the man who had gone from accused citizen to revealed U.S. attorney overnight. Instead of retreating, Marcus seized the opportunity to speak directly to the public. "This case isn't just about me," he said, his voice strong and resonant. "It's about exposing the cracks in our system and demanding change. What happened to me happens to countless others every day, people without titles or resources to fight back. We need reforms that ensure everyone is treated equally under the law, regardless of race, class, or background." His words struck a chord, sparking conversations across social media and news outlets nationwide. People shared stories of similar experiences, flooding platforms with hashtags like #JusticeForAll and #AccountabilityMatters. Activists and lawmakers praised Marcus for using his platform to highlight systemic issues, while critics debated whether his identity overshadowed the broader message. Despite the mixed reactions, one thing was undeniable. The trial had ignited a national dialogue about policing practices and civil rights. In the weeks that followed, Marcus returned to his role as Assistant U.S. Attorney, channeling his experience into tangible action. He spearheaded initiatives aimed at increasing transparency within police departments, advocating for body cameras, independent oversight boards, and stricter penalties for misconduct. He partnered with community organizations to educate citizens about their rights and provide resources for those affected by injustice. Though some colleagues questioned whether his involvement in such high-profile advocacy might jeopardize his career, Marcus remained undeterred. "This isn't about me," he told Angela during one of their late-night talks. "It's about making sure no one else has to go through what I did, or worse. If I don't use my position to push for change, then what's the point?" As the dust settled, Marcus found solace in knowing he had sparked something bigger than himself. His story became a rallying cry for reform, inspiring others to demand better from institutions meant to protect and serve. And though the road ahead remained long and challenging, Marcus walked it with renewed purpose, driven by the belief that real change begins when people refuse to stay silent in the face of injustice. Months after the trial, Marcus's life had returned to a semblance of normalcy, though nothing about his perspective was quite the same. The case had left an indelible mark on him, not just personally, but professionally as well. He carried the lessons from that night with him every day, using them to fuel his work as a U.S. attorney and advocate for systemic change. What started as a personal ordeal had transformed into a catalyst for broader conversations about equality and accountability in law enforcement. Back at his office, Marcus poured himself into drafting policies aimed at addressing the root causes of racial profiling and misconduct. He collaborated with lawmakers, community leaders, and even former police officers who shared his vision of reform. Together, they pushed for measures like mandatory implicit bias training, stricter guidelines for searches and seizures, and independent review boards to investigate complaints against officers. These initiatives weren't easy to implement. Resistance came from all sides, but Marcus refused to back down. Each small victory felt like progress toward a fairer system. Outside of policy work, Marcus became a sought-after speaker, invited to conferences, town halls, and schools across the country. His speeches were powerful yet relatable, blending legal expertise with raw honesty about his own experience. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he often said, his voice steady but impassioned. "But it starts when we acknowledge the problem, and when those with power use it responsibly." Audiences listened intently, moved not only by his words, but also by the humility with which he delivered them. The media continued to cover his story, framing him as both a victim of injustice and a champion for reform. While some praised his courage, others criticized him for being too outspoken or questioned whether his high-profile status overshadowed grassroots efforts. Marcus took the criticism in stride, understanding that no movement could please everyone. "If people are talking about these issues," he told Angela one evening, "then we're moving in the right direction." On a personal level, the trial had strengthened Marcus's bond with his family. Angela joked that she now saw him as a superhero, though Marcus laughed it off, insisting he was simply doing his job. His parents, proud but cautious, reminded him to take care of himself amidst the whirlwind of attention. And his colleagues, once skeptical of his activism, began to see him as a leader who inspired others to think bigger and aim higher. Despite the accolades and recognition, Marcus never lost sight of why he'd fought so hard in the first place. Late at night, sitting alone in his study, he sometimes replayed the events of that fateful traffic stop, the indignity of being handcuffed, the frustration of having his rights ignored, the quiet resolve that kept him going. Those memories grounded him, reminding him of the countless individuals who didn't have the resources or platform to fight back. For every person like Marcus, there were thousands more whose voices went unheard, and that thought drove him to keep pushing forward. As time passed, Marcus's story became more than just a headline. It became a symbol of resilience and hope. It inspired young lawyers to pursue careers in civil rights law, encouraged ordinary citizens to speak up against injustice, and challenged institutions to confront their biases. The ripple effects extended far beyond what Marcus could have imagined, proving that even one person's actions could spark meaningful change. One evening, as he stood on the balcony of his home watching the sunset, Marcus reflected on how far he'd come. The road ahead was still long, filled with challenges and setbacks, but he felt a deep sense of purpose. Justice wasn't something you achieved once and then walked away from. It was a constant pursuit, a commitment to making the world better than you found it. And as long as there were battles left to fight, Marcus knew he wouldn't stop fighting. For Marcus Thompson, this wasn't the end of the journey, it was just the beginning.